We're very lucky today to have three fabulous organizational leaders and visionaries who have taken their organizations forward from the 20th century into the 21st century. And they have wonderful varied backgrounds that I'll introduce you to right now. Starting on my far right, I've been lucky since 1991 to be on the faculty here at Michigan State University and to work in her role under Luana K. Simon when she was provost, and then now as president, and it's been an absolute joy. So let me tell you a little more about Dr. Simon. She's the 20th president of Michigan State University. She really has engaged Michigan State in a strategic and transformative journey to adapt the principles of the land-grant tradition to the 21st century challenges. She's a member of the American Council on Education and the Council on Competitiveness, a nonpartisan, non-governmental organization working to ensure U.S. prosperity. She's been an important higher ed leader nationally. She serves as the chair of the National Security Higher Education Advisory Board that works with governmental agencies having to do with security, intelligence, and law enforcement. She also has served as chair of the National Collegiate Athletic Association's Executive Committee, a very, very important role. All of us who have worked with Dr. Simon know that she is someone who balances on a day-to-day basis what the future looks like and the challenges of the current day, and does so in each moment as the leader of Michigan State University to really try to ensure our place is one of the leading institutions of higher education here in the United States. On her left, on my middle right, we're very happy to have Catherine Fraze joining us. She is helping us out by pitch hitting for her colleague who came down ill and was unable to join us. But Catherine was part of the first T-Summit last year at IBM and spoke at that first of these summits and was a very, very important speaker to all of us who were in attendance. Many of you were there. She serves as Vice President and Chief Technology Officer for IBM Public Sector. She started in that role in March of 2013. As Chief Technology Officer, she provides thought leadership for IBM and its customers on innovation and strategic transformation specific to government, education, life sciences, healthcare, and cities, really driving the creation of new solutions. She has an academic background, having a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Bryn Mawr and a PhD in materials science and engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. On my immediate right is Paula Cunningham. Now, Paula Cunningham, the interesting thing about having Paula on this panel is she actually has stood astride both of the sectors that Luana on the one side and Catherine on the other represent. She's currently the president and CEO of Capital National Bank here in Lansing. Regrettably, a position that she just told me at lunch she's only going to hold for a few more weeks before she takes on yet the next challenge in her life. Now, the challenge that she had before taking over as president and CEO of Capital National Bank was the presidency of Lansing Community College here in the capital city, which is one of the largest community colleges in the state of Michigan. She served there for 25 years in administration and also on the faculty, and she spent the last 6 years of her time at LCC as president. She earned a master's degree, very close to my heart, in my department, the school of, at that time called Labor and Industrial Relations at Michigan State, and a bachelor's degree in journalism, also here at Michigan State. So we are very lucky to have three panelists that can really help us understand how to tie it all together, how to bring this T to a very, very important kind of close in relation to the summit that we've had today. So all of the questions I'm about to pose to the panelists, they got in advance of today and were therefore able to think a little bit about it. Unfortunately for Catherine, that very well may be less than advance notice. but we tried to give some questions that really could bring this whole thing and tie it all together. You've been part of 3 different waves of breakout sessions. You've heard some very, very interesting plenary speakers throughout the day. Now is really the time to sit and reflect on all of that information and really try to bring it together across multiple sectors. So let me start and really start with Dr. Simon and move on down. A starting question for all 3 of you, which is, please tell us about the important shifts in your organization's environment and context which are driving you to embrace the challenges and opportunities within the development of T-shaped individuals.
Well, when I think about Michigan State University, and one of the questions that animates me every day is, what kind of university would society create if we were to do it all over again? So if you think about a land-grant university, and the first land-grant university, as Provost Hewitt talked about last night, we were created to meet uniquely American needs for promoting prosperity and quality of life, and to find a way to educate a new kind of community leader, a new kind of person to drive industry, particularly agriculture at the time. You fast forward into the growth period of American universities, the ascendancy of Michigan State as a top 100 place in the world, and you get the John Hannah Citizen Scholar. The idea that we could take the Chicago model of education, integrated studies as it's now called, and apply it in large numbers to students, as well as to keep with that connection to society and our employers. And what we hear now today is that there's a concern about a growing gap between the characteristics of our graduates and the emerging needs of industry. There's a gap, as I heard it, between what CEOs tell other CEOs about what they want for an individual to grow and be sustained in their company, and what initial employers were asking for in a very narrow skill set, and not a very good way to bridge that gap. Not a very good way to bridge that gap, and then to translate that back into what we're calling the global citizen scholar who can go anywhere and be successful throughout a variety of jobs in their career. So we simply built on Phil Gardner's work that he's been doing over a long period of time and talking to everyone except us. I kid Phil about this regularly, that I would see his quotes in publications, working with companies, getting all this employer impact input. And the question was, how does that feed back to what we're doing on a day-to-day basis? And that became a part of what we've been calling neighborhoods, and how we think about the articulation of the academic, more traditional experiences and those other things that happen in a great university in order for us to be able to educate people for the 21st century who have a capacity to think in context, think in teams, think quickly, but think in a wise fashion. And to be able to acquire knowledge as rapidly as possible for whatever circumstance they're in, but not to do that from the same frame over and over and over again. Because those are technicians. They're very good, and organizations need them. But Michigan State University's role is not to produce technicians. It's to produce those global leaders. And so we're trying then to build that into what you've heard from Doug and others, and the badge concept, the T-shaped person. My only regret, it's not an S, it's a T. And I've tried to work with Phil about this concept, but he seemed to be sort of out there, and it seemed to resonate with lots of people with the T, so we put a big heart on it. Because the other aspect of this that we're really working on is not so much the cognitive knowledge that goes with that, because you can see that in the work that Doug and others have done over a long period of time as we've changed integrative studies, looked at the overall overarching goals of undergraduate education. It's about all this affective skills, this capacity to work in varieties of ways and take the bumps and bruises of the world that also is a part of that big heart. And so we're now going to put that, as Chris Wren and others told you, into the freshman experience and build that through other ways of assessing where I'm calling them nano certificates. These guys call them badges. I like nano certificates better because they sound a lot fancier than a badge. And we're going to think about ways in which we can build that in, so we're not, as the speaker this morning talked about, adding more and more time to the undergraduate experience, because that's not an option. That's not an option. Particularly, it's not an option for the students who come from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. But they need to leave the university with all these skills. So they need to leave be able to compete on an even playing field, even though they didn't arrive necessarily with skills from a variety of backgrounds that were the same. And that isn't by adding year 5 and year 6. It's by rethinking the nature of the undergraduate experience. And I think that's the thing we're trying to do. I'm also trying to translate that better into leadership skills that Sharon Butler is talking about for the 21st century workforce, and the way in which we think about leading change in the organization.
Catherine?
So I think I'll take it from a slightly different angle. I'll go back to something that Jim Sporer said earlier today when he introduced the notion of T-shaped IBM, and that Nick D'Onofrio, who was a senior exec for us for many years and was sort of the godfather of the technical community. But the background to how Nick came up with the T notion was originally not about education and training. It came out of frustration when he would go and meet with a client, and the client would bring 1 or 2 people, and IBM would bring 10. And what he realized was that the reason that IBM brought 10 is because each of us was an expert in something. We were wonderful eyes. And it wasn't that we couldn't talk to each other, but we couldn't see through each other's eyes. So I didn't mean that as a pun. And he said, you know, we need to figure out how to be more T-shaped as our customers are. Our customers understand their full business and then probably have one piece of it they care about as individuals. So that was sort of the background to the T. And we see that more and more every day in everything that we do. So there's that aspect of it, and there's this aspect of the T-shape that is not just broad skills and deep skills. But if you look at the little diagram we all have in our books, that deep piece has an industry dimension as well as a discipline dimension. It's not finance in the abstract, it's finance in retail or finance in energy, for example, right? The way that businesses think. The second piece to it is that in the old days, IBM, frankly, did IT for IT people, right? And you've all seen our posters about Smarter Planet in the airport. It is not just a marketing slogan. It is, in fact, what we wake up in the morning passionate to do, which is to bring technology to bear on real problems of real humans. And if you're going to solve real problems of real humans any place in the world, then you'd better know how to talk to humans and answer problems for humans. And so that's the second element of T, which is global and interdisciplinary. And then the third piece that I think we haven't talked enough about is the way in which T-shaped brings with it an understanding that you will share. And that as an institution, as an organization, yes, it's important that everybody can learn more things. It's vital, vital. But it's just as important that they are willing to share and to teach their colleagues going forward. I-shaped is about I am an expert and I will keep my knowledge to myself because it is my power. T-shaped is we succeed as a team and I will share what I know for your benefit and I assume that you will share with me.
So just to follow up, are you talking in a way about a moral imperative, that's really a kind of a responsibility that IBMers have to each other and to clients in relation to that kind of sharing that you're talking about?
I think it is, and it fits into the values of the company. But, you know, values are great, metrics are better. So, you know, in order to actually, we can all wake up in the morning and we all intend to do the right moral thing for the day. And then we have some other imperatives as well, like feeding our families. And so it's also important that the organization align how we measure success, how we develop people, how we hire people. If we're serious about this, then it has to pervade everything else that we do.
Okay, thank you so much.
I think if I could tag on to this, going back to something you said last year, we've talked about subsequently, is about one of the real powers potentially of the T it both will provide you the moral imperative that will sustain you through the kinds of changes we have, but also can positively affect the bottom line in ways that are mutually reinforcing.
Absolutely.
And in corporate America in particular, both of those things have to happen in order for it to be sustainable as a corporate culture. Is that?
And yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'd add one last piece to it, which is that sometimes we talk about global, right? And we talk about we need our students and our employees to understand things in a global context. I'll quote Tip O'Neill. It's St. Patrick's Day after all. Business is local also. Politics is local, but so is business local. And so this ability through our T-shaped skills to work in truly global teams, to understand if you're going to fix a water system, that the underlying technology may be the same, but the way you have it show up for the customer is very different in rural Kenya than it is in Detroit or in Stockholm, right? And this T-shaped piece, you know, global is not about being a tourist. It's about really being able to see through someone else's eyes.
Great. Paula?
Well, I could talk about this all day. About 8 years ago, I'll give you a story. We talk about this T-shaped learner. About eight and a half years ago, I went to a conference, and they had this big machine at this conference, and they said, listen, this is the machine that's coming to all the financial institutions throughout the country, and all you have to do is throw all your money into the machine. It'll count the money for you, and it'll be able to tell you exactly what you deposited, and then give you a little tab and say, thank you, Mrs. Cunningham, you just deposited, $85.23. And then it had another machine that said in just a few years we'll be able to have this camera on your phone that will be able to take a picture of a check. And you don't even have to go to a bank. You can see where I'm going with this. This is years ago. So immediately I go back from education, believing in continuous learning, pull everyone together that's doing those jobs and saying to them, listen, you guys, technology is going to take over what you're currently doing. And I'm here to help you figure out what else you can do to elevate your skills. What training, what learning do you need? Successful, to be relevant to our customers, to the industry, et cetera. And what I saw was fear, because what people had learned was they had learned what they know how to do, and they know how to do that well. Learning something else outside of that I-shaped or that skill base, there was a lot of anxiety and concern over what can I do, what am I capable of doing. The potential was there, but not really knowing how to do that. So you have to create entire systems inside of the workplace, not just look to education to do this. Because having been in education, I can tell you almost every employer, and Luana can address this, almost every employer in the state, in the city, in the region wants you to come and they want to tell you how to change your curriculum, what you need to be doing. You know, they need a internet repair person right away. They need a web designer right away. They don't want to pay for it. When you send them a web designer, oh, but this person doesn't know how to think, or this person, bring them in for one specific level. I have a philosophy I've had for years that you hire 2 levels up, at least 2 levels up. So the person that you're hiring for the job today should be able to work at least 2 levels higher than the job that you're hiring them for. Well, employers need to also take responsibility in terms of some of that, not just look to education to do all of the training. And actually, if you're talking about education, I think it should start from 0 to 3. I think it should start with preschool and teaching students how to read, because for a lot of our students, a lot of the employees, they can't get to the internships. They can't get to the quality education that's being offered in a lot of places. But reading opens the doors to so much of that. Their parents may not know how to read, but learning and just developing the sense of learning. So I could go on and on about how you develop both the broad thinking and the T part of that. You look at our business in terms of finance and industry. That's one of the fastest growing industries there are today. And venture capitalists are taking over how you do loans. You have angel investors. People aren't even going to banks anymore. In our bank, we primarily work with small to medium-sized businesses. Don't come to us if you want a toaster, if you open a new checking account. That's not who we are. But businesses are going somewhere else now to get that financing. I can literally get my business financed by people I've never seen before, some of whom live in India, some of whom live in China, by putting a proposal online and going and saying, here's my proposal, and competing with a lot of other folks. And I might pay 10, 15, 20% interest on that, but I don't have to deal with banks. So from the world that I sit in currently today, you have to look at relevancy, you have to look at sustainability, you have to look at your workforce and say, is this the right workforce to take us to the future, to take us to the next 30 years or 34 years of being in existence? And in many cases, it may or may not be the right workforce, but we need to hire smarter, we need to train differently inside of the organization so that people do have an opportunity to grow and to develop potential. And as I talk to people and folks say, well, how do you make the transition from education to banking? Ladies and gentlemen, it's a skill set that transfers no matter where you're going. Whether budgeting is budgeting no matter where you're going. Building teams is building teams no matter where you're going. And so learning that, and thank goodness I went through the Labor Industrial Relations at the time. Now I know the name has changed, the Human Resources Industrial Relations Program. They taught us that. They taught you how to think critically. And it's exciting. So the future's changing. You're always looking down the road to see what's coming and whether or not we are still going to be here, relevant, and meeting the needs of this global that we live in 10, 15, 20 years down the road is an important question.
Well, let's talk a little bit about those young people. I mean, I think President Simon already talked about them to a degree. But both the higher education sector on the one side and the employing sectors, a variety of employing sectors on the others, have kind of a real need to create strong environments for young people in relation to personal growth and development on the one side. And also, we've heard a lot today about entrepreneurship and innovation. So could you talk about what can all of the different sectors do to really create the strongest possible environments for young people to grow and develop on the one side and to really innovate and be entrepreneurial on the others? Dr. Simon, you want to take that up first?
Well, I think that part of it is having a very complex and potentially very messy environment. Mm-hmm. Because when you think about, we have 50,000 students, their touch points are going to be slightly different in order to educate them in a way that people are talking about. It's not a cookie cutter approach. There are packets of knowledge that are cookie cutter, but the experience cannot be, if you think about it that way. So when you even think about a class that has 200 people in it, and I do a poll of their interaction with a faculty member, a great faculty member can bring out at least 50 or 60 different ways of thinking about knowledge in that class. So what we need to think about is how do we have the right benchmarks, metrics for this journey that students need to have when they're part of a university that increases the probability that both they have purposeful experiences that lend itself to this T-shaped behavior, but also that we understand how to take advantage of serendipity. Because a lot of, when I talk to people and alums about the greatest part of their experience, it wasn't always what they planned to have. It was the bumping in things and having faculty, staff around them when they bumped into that moment were able to take that moment and not make it a casual glance, but make it a meaningful experience. And that's a very different role and a very different way of thinking for the role that everyone has to play in a learning environment. And we have to work on that in a different way. I also think that we have to continue to work with employers to try to argue effectively, Paula's comment about preparing people for 2 or 3 levels above where you're hiring them. The pressures of getting the bottom line right has put a lot of focus on these narrow skills. I believe that it's harder as people move through the workforce to build the breadth and the T-shaped thinking if they started out too narrowly on the technical side. I mean, they get so stuck that they're not able to see things through other people's eyes. They still try, but they really don't have that capacity. And while organizations move around them, they'll sort of continue to hang on to, and Paula, you're nodding your head because you both have seen this in your organization. So I think we have to also work more effectively through internships, partnerships with organizations outside the university to reinforce the fact that this developmental task needs to start with this broader array of skills, and then you can always learn a new skill. if the student has been educated correctly, as opposed to valuing that very narrow skill that fits immediately the checkbox that the corporation needs. We have to work together on that.
If I can follow up and ask this question, so if one of the things that we can really do in our environment is create more possibilities of meaningful accidents, meaningful collisions, to use your word, what kind of possibilities are there for that kind of increase? Or neighborhoods one of those answers? Or
I think for us, neighborhoods 2.0, because there'll be a neighborhoods 3.0, was an evolution of these conversations. You know, back in my misspent youth, before we were counted so heavily by bookkeepers about credit hours, we used to add on an extra credit hour for a course for doing unusual things. Yeah, it was a great idea at the time. It came out of part of this development area, and then we got auditors who we couldn't document what that meant and everything, so it went away and we became much more structured. But there are a lot of ideas about ways in which one can get credit for these experiences. I also think the flipped classrooms, different ways of teaching and learning that we're now experimenting with, really put the faculty member as coach and mentor more than as provider of content. And so the physical structure and other things are going to have to change to be able to account for how that fits into a credit hour, since the new study that was done nationally suggested that the credit hour will remain for a very long time. And doing competency-based education is okay, but I think there has to be some blend of the more traditional credit hour with a competency base, and that's the idea of the badges or the nano certificates or ways in which one takes these collisions and is able to document them and assess them in different ways.
Catherine, what kind of things in the employing sector or on the flip side in the higher ed sector, from your point of view, how do we create environments for young people to grow and develop on the one side and to innovate and be entrepreneurial on the other?
So I think there are a couple of things. One is, I think, with very few exceptions, I think most of the new students coming into higher ed kind of get this better than we do, right? Education has always been a social enterprise. These kids are more social and more nimble than any of us ever were. You know, for as much as the women in the room have always teased our husbands that, you know, when all else fails, read the instruction manual, I challenge you to find anybody under the age of 25 that even cares that there was one, right? They'll just figure it out. And so those behaviors make them, so rather than thinking of it as how do we create environments for them to collaborate and learn from one another and be innovative and entrepreneurial, I think the question is really how do we get out of their way? You know, whether certainly inside a corporate environment, you know, there's always some balance of how risk tolerant are you? Because if you're really going to be innovative, stuff is going to not work, right? So how do you provide an environment where it's at a small scale okay to fail, and an environment in which you can learn from that, right? Some of that is as simple as how do you configure the workspace, right? Less walls, more open, more sunshine, free coffee. You know, there's a bunch of things you can do, right? That encourages people to not fall into the corporate trap of sitting in their office and not bothering to walk around the corner to talk to somebody, right? So I think that there are things that we can do. I am sure that there is more that we can do. Right? One of the things that we've been experimenting with in IBM is not just with our young people, but with all of us. Because the other half of the question is, what do we do with all the workforce that's not under 25? You know, you're kind of stuck with a bunch of us for a while. And we need to learn stuff too, and we need to learn to be more innovative and more entrepreneurial and more social. And so we've been trying out some stuff inside IBM, our own sort of internal MOOC. And as with all MOOCs, I will say that the first couple were like deadly boring, but they're getting better. And so once a month, first Friday of every month, there is a new topic out there for all IBMers, not just to receive content on analytics or mobile or social or security or whatever, but a chance to have an online conversation about it, additional materials for you to explore if you're really interested. All the things we talk about in a higher ed context, can you get it to work with 400,000 people, most of whom are over 25, all around the world? So we're trying. I'm sure there's more we could do.
Okay. Paula?
Yeah, I come from a little different environment. You know, IBM is a multinational company. We're a small community bank. Half of 70% of the students who graduate will go to small to medium-sized companies to work. And bottom line is there are a lot of companies, even though I 300% agree with everything that's being said, they just won't take the time. They just won't, because they're looking at their bottom line. They've got to get a certain ROI. They've got to have a certain financial responsibility. And so to shift employers' mentality about how critical this is, you are not going to get the best of that limited talent pool unless you start doing the kinds of things that Catherine's talking about, unless we start doing the kinds of things that she's talking about. So for us, it's not so much what we can learn from education, it's what we can learn from the students who are coming to us in terms of what they want, in terms of, they want more recreational time than they care about a salary. They want a little bit of both, but that's really important to them, is how much time off do I get? Do I have flexible time? Do I have to come into work every day? And so for our ability to adapt and to change as quickly as the onslaught of new employees are coming to us, is one of the barriers, quite frankly, because we don't move as quickly, particularly depending on how rigid the environment is. I'm in banking, ladies and gentlemen, okay? I'm not even going to go there, but I'm in banking. Just let that penetrate for a moment. So how quickly we can change that environment, it really dictates whether or not they're going to come to a financial institution or to an insurance institution, or whether they're going to go somewhere else based on that. So one of the things I think we can do is offer more internships, offer more collaboratives. You know, one of the first things we say, oh, we don't want an intern because we have to spend too much time to train them. That's what the supervisor always says. It just takes so much time to get them up to speed. Well, it's not about having them come in and help with the work. It's about us learning from them as well, learning what it is that they want when they come to the workplace, so that we can be more progressive. Employers can be more progressive. We can be more responsive in terms of what that next generation of learners and workers, and hopefully those who contribute to our Social Security and retirement, want from the workplace. So I think that's critically important. I'm talking with a high school student today, literally today, who is going to Brown University, full scholarship, local high school student, and she doesn't have to even go to school right now. She's gotten her GPA, she's where she needs to be, but yet she's still in school. Why not use the second half of a semester for volunteerism and make it required? Why not use the second half to get inside of an organization or wherever she wants to go, whatever, a hospital, whatever, to require that? So there's so many missed opportunities that even before we get to higher education that would make life a lot easier for those going into higher education to be able to, to acclimate themselves to the wonderful programs and initiatives and that's going on there. But it's hard for small businesses to turn and to offer the kinds of progressive learning opportunities that we should be offering. And I preach this all the time. I just left a meeting. I had to go to a meeting with Small Business Association of Michigan. We were talking about this, and I brought for you, this was hot off the press. There'll be a press release tomorrow. It talks about Michigan Entrepreneurial Scorecard and how entrepreneurial Michigan is compared to the other states. And we've made tremendous progress, significant progress. And I dare say that a lot of the jobs that we're training people for today, or they think they want today, won't even exist 5 or 6 years down the road. So my question to young people isn't so much what do you want to do or what do you want to be when you grow up, but what are you going to create? What doesn't exist? Where's your passion? Because whatever your passion is, we can make room for that. And I can guarantee you we can figure out how to make money off of it also. So it's a whole different conversation that we need to have as employers.
Well, let me just try to summarize for 2 seconds and then throw it back to all three of you again, which is that what you're saying is that, in effect, students are already where they are. We have to really understand where they are and really maybe take down some of the barriers that are standing in the way of them within higher education or within the employing sector, so that they can really begin to grow and develop and do all those things that they already know full well that they know how to do, or that they want to learn how to do better. So what are some of those barriers that might exist in higher education, on the education generally on the one side, or in the employment sector, and what are especially those barriers that we have to take down jointly? That is, because if we can take them down singly, we don't necessarily need each other, but are there specific things that we can only work on across the, really hands across both the employment sector on the one side and higher education on the other? Anyone who wants to start would be great in terms of follow-up.
Paul, I want to sort of tag on to something Paula said, and maybe she can respond on it. I think one of the things that Paul and I have talked about over the years is how do we get people into shorter experiences, to particularly early on in their academic careers or in high school, to be able to sample more things before they decide what they want to do. And how do we've tried unsuccessfully, so in the community, to get some job sharing internships where people went to more than one place to work, as opposed to staying within a single place for their internship, particularly, again, early on in their career. And then also, as we've looked at younger employees, to get smaller, medium-sized corporations to share experiences of their employees across those barriers. And I could say the same would be true within the university across some of the silos that we have. It may be true in IBM as well, where we hire individuals into an X role, we'll put FRIB, and then we also hire somebody over in physical plant or IPF and somebody over here. And we don't give them the broad exposure, even in a place like this, across these silos. So they really don't ever understand the university. Most folks who are in the support services don't really understand what academics do. They have some of the disdain that people have in the business world about those fuzzy-headed academics. That's really, if you think about it, and building up the kind of team we need. I know you're struggling with that at IBM about how to move people through your own silos while you're also making the silos broader. So let me pass that back to you as a couple of examples of things I know that Paul and I have talked about and been unsuccessful, and I know you're working on within IBM.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I think one of the debates is always, if you aspire to the T, which piece do you do first? Do you do the broad piece first or the deep piece first? And it's a question on the academic side, but it's also a question on the employer side, right? Do you rotate somebody around through a bunch of jobs for 2 years and then have them pick someplace to go deep? Do you start them someplace deep and then give them a chance to move around now that they've actually learned something about the company? We don't have the right answer. I'll just say that. And so we're running a lot of experiments. I think one of the impediments, frankly, is a human one, which is we all have a tendency to think that someone's future career path should look like ours did. And so there is a certain, I don't think it's about IBM, I think it's a human thing, right? That if it took me 5 years to get from my entry-level role to my first promotion, well, then it must be that somebody should take 5 years to do that. Well, it isn't necessarily so, both because the world has changed and because it is entirely possible that the kids we're hiring now are smarter than me. I get that. But we have a tendency to have processes and measurement systems that expect you to go through all the same gates in the same sequence that has worked so well for the organization for a long time. And so recognizing it is the first problem, right? Is when a young person comes to you, and I was interested by your question, John, because they do know how to do many things and we need to get out of their way, but they don't know how to do everything. Mm-hmm. And whether they're 18 when they come here or they're 22 when they come to us, some of them are smarter than they think they are, and some of them are not as smart as they think they are, right? And they actually need a little guidance. And so getting that balance right so that we don't believe them sometimes when they think they're smarter than they are, but that we don't slow them down when they are in fact smarter than we are. It's this notion of how do you develop some flexible assessment models is what it really comes down to, of how do I know when it's time to let somebody try something new, is some of what we're struggling with. sort of a fuzzy answer. But.
Yeah, and we provide an environment for that to occur as well. I didn't mean to say because we're a smaller organization that doesn't exist. It exists in a lot of smaller organizations. It's just how it exists and how extensive it is. And even just decision making. I hired a young man, and he was 19 years old. And we were in an executive leadership team meeting, and everyone was having input. And I asked him, I said, "You haven't said anything, Deshaun. Give me, what's your opinion?" And he raised his hand, which surprised me because we were just talking informally. And he said, "Mrs. Cunningham, I didn't even know I had an opinion until I started working here, because my mother always told me to shut up, be quiet, and be still." So there are times when you just giving them the opportunity to start thinking, and that sounds so simplistic, but to take that and to value that thought process and turn it into something tangible, no matter how big, how large, how small. And sometimes you get away from that inside of corporate America or inside of our businesses, because again, we're so focused on what we know we have to do, what the processes tell us we have to do, that we forget about that creative side. And frankly, that's, people ask, how did you make the transition from education to banking? That's really why I was brought in. I remember during that process, I was told, you need to prepare the bank for the next 34 years. And what is it going to take to prepare it for the next 34 years? You don't have to worry about answering questions about, credit analysis or actuarial and all. That's not what we want you for, Paul. We want you to build the future with the team that you have without breaking the spirit. And that was a large order. It is a large order. But that's what we set out to do even for a small organization, is how do you build that future? What's changing? What's coming? And I guarantee you that if we tap into the potential that's there now and give people an opportunity to create something that doesn't exist and support them in that, they'll come up with all sorts of ideas, some of which won't work, because you're right, they think they're smarter than they are, but some of which will. But if if we can figure out ways to help cultivate of creative thinking inside the organization, that complements what they're learning and what's going on inside the classroom as well. I don't want anyone to leave school or to leave the 6th grade or to leave 6 years of a higher post-secondary education with a period behind every sentence. You want them to leave with a comma, to be continued. There's more to come. And so many times we say, as you're just saying, we said, this is it. This is how it's supposed to happen. And that's, I have very little patience for that, because I don't know how it's supposed to happen, but I know I can figure it out. I know enough people, we know enough people collectively to have the resources, to have the knowledge that we know how to learn and how to make things happen. And that's what's exciting about the continuous learning, which we also need to promote, whether we are, a 2 or 3 mile-power organization, whether we are a $200 million bank, or whether we are IBM or MSU. We need to continuously learn, and you can't learn when you're talking, so I'll be quiet.
So I just want to jump onto that for 1 second.
Yeah, and then over.
Okay.
No, you first, Kath, and then over to Luana.
Because this notion of listening is so important. So I don't necessarily recommend this experience, but one of my sons interned for IBM 3 summers in a row in different parts of the company. And to have your kid come home at the end of almost every day and say, "Mom, why do we do this way?" is a really educational process. And it makes you really aware of how many, and you realize that because we've always done it that way is a really bad answer. So it's a gift. Being able to really listen to them react to what looks normal to us is a gift.
I was going to sort of tag on to that, because I think it's in part one of the things you see in these very entrepreneurial companies is sort of like free idea Friday, okay? Where people dress up, they move around in different parts of the spaces that they have, and it's a free idea, that there's no constraint about the idea. You can provide an idea for somebody else's area, you can provide an idea, but it doesn't have to be in the frame that you're currently working in. That's why it's a free day. It doesn't have to necessarily fit. It can be a piece way out here. Okay? Or it can be a piece that totally challenges, as your son did, the why question of what you do. And most of the real change occurs out of some of those free Friday ideas, even in the most entrepreneurial companies. Because they let you find a piece that you're going to grow into, that you're going to invest in, that you don't need right now, because you have talent and capacity in your workforce to be able to do that odd thing. it also lets you be able to reflect on the frame and how constraining that frame might be for the new ideas that you say you want to have, but they simply never happen in the way or with enough speed, because there's a huge impediment in the organization around the existing frame in which ideas are put in. And so part of the, I think, the 21st century leadership question is really people in organizations who are so T-shaped that they can work in these alternative universes, that they can move in and do the things that are very much a part of the I part of the T, but they can instantly flip over and operate in a whole new kind of frame. And it's like moving back and forth if you're fluid in languages. That you can, if you're really good at it, you can think in both languages. Then you happen to speak in one, right? And that's really, I think, the key to sort of the T-shaped leadership and how we're going to develop the students through their experiences here, and as we follow them through the Alumni Association, which is a very important part of this, because they're not going to get everything when they're here, and their company won't necessarily be able to provide those kinds of experiences. So the Alumni Network becomes the lifelong learning connection, Scott's in the back, for doing all of this, not simply doing a raw event around around a football or a basketball game. That's important because it brings people together and it makes you feel good, but it's not what we need to be doing most of the time in what universities need to do. And so what I think you'll see in the pitch I'm making to companies is I want you to help, I want us to work together to align your lifelong learning needs with what we need to produce for our students as well. So it's not two separate tracks. It's not two separate tracks. And part of that will be mediated and part of it will be more in person.
And as an employer, we have to reward that kind of behavior. You know, I could talk all day about punished by rewards, you know, in terms of what we reward in the workplace. But we have to make certain that if we say it's a value, that it's, you know, they may not be producing the way that we think, the more traditional way of producing, you know, outcomes, performance, or whatever. But if they're creating something, if they're looking outside of the box to try to create the future and help us in some other not so tangible way, but thinking, we have to figure out how to create and how to reward that as well. That's a value that we have as an employer. That's a value that we have as an organization, that we want creative thinkers. We want someone to come up with an idea that actually will change the face of our organization, or perhaps not, maybe just change one small part of it, you know, just one small corner of it. But we need to be able to reward that so that we continue to encourage that kind of behavior, and not just continue to reward things that we always reward. And again, I could talk all day about reward systems, and that's another conference, though.
Well, and I think that you've really segued well into a concern that came up after Jeff Salengo's talk this morning. And let me put the question to you this way. Not all American students share the same pipeline into higher education. So how do diversity and overcoming the disparities based in income, race, class, ethnicity, and gender fit into our plans for moving into a T-shaped future? To what degree do we have to really see that the organization of the future is going to be very different than the organization of the past? I think you've already said that, Catherine, that for the most part, we have to now design organizations that are not based in who we are and what we are, but are really based in very, very different things. So how do we deal with those issues of disparity? How do we deal with the really embracing the diversity in such a way that understands that we don't necessarily all start in the same starting blocks? So anyone want to take that on, Catherine?
I'll start, but I'm sure others will have things to say. I'll start by saying it's hard. And I'll go back to something that Bob Keegan said last night at dinner when he told the joke about the guy who had stopped drinking, so he was only drinking his brother's 2 shots, not his own. It is hard to know what blind spots you have, whether that's as an individual or as an organization. And so there are some of these things that I think require measurement to keep yourself honest, right? I'll do an obvious one. In any organization, you can find pockets that for some reason haven't hired a woman in years. Now, they never woke up in the morning to say, I don't want to hire a woman. It just so happened that every person they ever interviewed that seemed like they would fit best just happened not to be. And so the only way to get past that is to actually call it out as something to be measured and rewarded or not, right, in order to force ourselves. That doesn't solve the pipeline at the front end issue, and we should talk about that. But on the employer end, there's a reason why we have to have real optics. You know, it's not quotas. I won't use any of those, you know, freighted words. But you have to have optics on it in order to protect yourself from the blind spots that you didn't know you had. And the same is true not just at the employment level, but then, you know, are you being open-minded in how you think about promotion? Are you being open-minded in how you develop your slate of future leaders? Who's going to get that extra training? Who's going to get that international experience, right? Because we all are most comfortable with the people most like us, and we have to fight against it.
Let me just follow up and then invite everybody else
Let me
in.
add on that.
Okay.
And also with the people who do things exactly like we do them.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
Which is the other, which
The
is,
other
I think, the
diversity.
other diversity piece of this that is often sort of a part of, if you think about the research on leadership styles, including some that your department has just done, John, about words that are used, particularly for women and people of color, that styles, approaches, what constitutes good things, and then often there's a norm about how you do things that's embedded in different mores. And if you're judged not on simply the competencies, but on the way in which you do things. And that's really one of, Paul is not, and so it's really a very interesting dynamic. While you still encounter, and my colleagues would agree with that, what I would call the junk of sexism. That is just the not listening part or the other pieces of style. There's still all of that exists that you just sort of take for granted and don't worry about it much because it gets in your way of success. But there's also this underlying piece of the sort of the prototypes even among women. And if you don't fit the prototype, then, or Denise is 92 or whatever it is, you don't fit the prototype, it becomes harder even if you have a different way that's very successful in doing things. And that's part of, I think, this dynamic about diversity as it relates to the workforce. But Paula, you may want to jump in here.
Wow.
So
I go back to what Catherine said when she first started responding to this particular question. It's hard. It is really, really hard. Let me start with some of the most creative minds, some of the most fantastic leaders are people who are in prison, people who have gotten into all sorts of trouble, who never make it to the halls of academia. And I remember I had a building once, and we had all the security in the building, and I was asking my son, I thought, you know, because I wanted to secure the building, and will people be able to come in through this way or come in through that way? He said, listen, Mom, he said, why don't I bring somebody, because he's a behavioral specialist, and he works with problem kids, and he said, why don't I bring some of the kids in, and they can tell you how they'd break into this building, and then you know how to secure it, versus paying all these other companies and firms all this money to figure out how to break into the building, and we did. And they bought them pizza and lunch, and it was sort of like it became their building because they had some ownership in that building because they had some stake in what was going on there. And I thought, if one of these folks break into my building after they've been inside, but they didn't. I mean, to this day, there's some ownership there. So there is and I could debate this from either side. Are some of these skills innate? Are they just part of our DNA? Can we learn them? My philosophy is that you can learn them. That is, all of it, a lot of it has to do with environment. That's why I mentioned earlier about even the 0 to 3 or the preschool or the 3rd and 4th graders. You know, prisons are built based on whether or not 3rd graders are how the literacy level of 3rd graders, whether or not they can read or write by the time they get to the 3rd grade. But if I'm from a single family, I don't have time to take my child to the museum, I don't have time to take my child to, the art fair to talk about those things, or I don't have the resources to do that, my critical thinking skills are going to be very different than someone who does have that kind of exposure. And what some of the brain science has taught us is that by the time a child gets to kindergarten, and I might have the numbers wrong, they should have about 800, 900 words in their vocabulary. But if they aren't from a family that is talking with them at dinner and is having those kind of conversations, their vocabulary may only be 300 or 400 words. And so by the time they get to the third grade, they're always trying to catch up, always trying to understand. So I'm not asking the same kinds of questions that someone else is. I'm not exploring possibilities the way that someone else is. How do you change that? Well, you each have an opinion about how to change that. Some of you would say, well, go to the parent's job. Someone would say it's the school's job. Someone would say, well, my global world says it's all of our responsibilities, that if you come in contact with me, it's my responsibility to ask you and to pull out that potential leadership that's inside of you. It's all of our responsibilities to help to create that kind of environment, to work, and again, to forge partnerships with business, community, with neighborhoods, to make certain that we're paying attention to what's going on and what's happening. Why is it that so many of the people who are creating, they don't need, as Catherine said, we don't need a manual. Men don't need a manual. They kind of throw it away. Anyone under 25 doesn't want to pay attention to a manual. They're thinking already creative. They're figuring out how to pull the parts together. I'm not worried about the student who comes to Michigan State University, quite frankly, because this is a quality institution, and they are going to teach them everything they possibly can. If they don't learn it, then shame on them. But the MSU will continue to try to teach them that, teach them what they want to know. I am worried about the student who never sees themselves fitting in to a Michigan State University because they don't have the GPA, they don't have the kind of experience that we all say we need in academia in order to enter into the classroom here. And so how do you motivate, how do you change that pipeline in order to make them see themselves fitting into or changing the environment so that they can be the CEOs and the leaders that we need to be? It's a whole different problem.
But let me sort of, because I worry about the ones who come here, so one of the things that I think is a flip of thinking, if you listen to all of the conversations regarding T-shaped people, and you think about your institution, I'll think about ours historically, there are certain activities that are really fun to do, whether it's undergraduate research or founding a company or bumping in and being able to explore a challenge or a problem that you want to do, that mostly goes to the people we've deemed as the smartest who came here. Okay. Now, there are other institutions where the smartest who came here are the people who are at the bottom of our curve or the smartest someplace else. So they would have gotten those opportunities. Okay? So why are we, in this day and age, limiting those kinds of opportunities to people who have gotten through some hoops first? And maybe those opportunities that are the most challenging in the way we think about self-space and creativity are the exact ones that need to be first for our most disadvantaged students, as opposed to the other way around where you have to earn some of those. Okay. And I'm struck with when I listen to students who have done study abroad and what it does for their worldview about America. Okay. And I think about kids from rural and urban Michigan who have very skewed, in my terms, worldviews because they're not diverse, whichever direction you want to talk about, with some very difficult economic challenges, not the same, but different, but still feeling as if they're difficult economic challenges from the point of view of the student and their family. But we require them to wait a while for study abroad because they're not, quote, ready for it. And maybe we should be doing it at the beginning. Because when you get to a study abroad, everybody's the same. A lot of those issues that we deal with coming here at the beginning go away. They go away. And yet we're reluctant to do that experiment. Okay? We're reluctant to find independent studies for the students who haven't demonstrated the capacity to do that work yet by passing all of these courses at a high level. And if they don't pass them at a really high level, they probably won't be necessarily asked to have those responsibilities. For me, that's the inherent way that we have to think about the unintended consequences of our system around particularly socioeconomic class, race, and gender. Okay. And how we have the courage to bend the system, to really bend the system, to be able to make that happen. And it's not just us bending the system, it's the students who are coming, their families bending the system. Because that seems like it's going to be really risky to start out in that way, really risky. So it comes at it from both directions. And we get stuck doing the same thing a little bit better. So part of the neighborhoods and part of the badges and some of the other things we're trying is to try to make a small step to be a little less stuck in that piece. I personally would prefer to make a bigger step. But I got a lot of people with curriculums and process to deal with. You know, I'll continue.
And that's why I'm not worried about students who come to Michigan State University, because you do have that kind of creative thinking and leadership going on. You know, we talk about the globalization and small business and how we can get partner with that. I mean, even as a community bank, and I don't mean to say we're that small, but even as a community bank, we partnered with business industry to bring Chinese students into the bank. And even though regulators say, well, they can't do this, they can't do that, by the time that we got through the regulatory process, all they could do is get a glass of water and leave. But we found ways to do that, and we socialized. We had Thanksgiving, and each person bought a Chinese student. So they're to their home, you know, those who could, to their home, or those who couldn't. We had different global kinds of conversations about what is it like to be a Chinese student for everybody, and everyone had to participate. So even though you may not be able to take the trip abroad, which I did, which was wonderful, changed my life, which many of you have done, but everybody can't do that. So what can you bring as an employer? What's our responsibility? What can we do? Because it's not so much our bottom line. I'm learning. Look at the changing demographics. I mean, how many Chinese students do you have? 5,000 plus Chinese students that come just this year?
A little bit higher, but it's okay.
Just this year? I mean,
Yeah.
so I've got products to sell. I've got services. So if you don't want to do it from a moral imperative, if you don't want to do it from a social imperative, do it from, you got to have a successful business imperative, your financial imperative. If that's the only thing that motivates you, I don't care what motivates you, but something ought to, in terms of opening up our doors, opening up whether it's a small business, and those are the doors, or whether it's, a multi-billion-dollar business, and those are the doors, to expose our, and I don't like the word employees, but our team members to those types of experiences when they may not have been exposed to them otherwise. We have that responsibility as CEO, president, leaders, et cetera, to do those types of things.
Now, it's amazing how quickly an hour goes.
Yeah.
Now, the one comment that I just feel that I have to make is that I think that the one challenge that we've heard throughout the day is many students might bypass becoming a T because all they think that they can afford is an I. And that whole notion of trying to overcome kind of institutional barriers that send different messages, and I think all three of you have spoken loud and clear to that, and we have to, I think, continue to really confront that and see what we can do.
Being a T is part of tuition.
And let me suggest...
It's really as simple as that.
Let me suggest that what I'd love to have you do is just a quick closing remark from each of you, and then we're going to turn this program over to Phil and Jim to end it. So why don't we start with Paula and just go down the line.
What can we do in order to forge the...
Oh, no. Just any closing remark that you want to make
geez.
about this panel or about the day.
There's so much energy in this room. There's so much expertise in this room. And so many times we think, oh, we have to go back and get our board to do this, we get our, or the whole world to get on board with us. And there was a book I read years and years ago, I think it was by William Baldridge, who talked about transitions. And so you only need 30% of any organization in order to change the culture in an organization. So my closing remarks would be, don't think that you have to go back and get the whole right world on board. You've learned enough, seen enough, spoken to enough people, have enough resources that you can start somewhere. So let's not use inertia or anything else as excuse, or that I can't move my organization. We are our organizations, and we can help to provide other opportunities, additional opportunities for TEA learners, and to create more TEA learners, because we really don't know what's coming tomorrow. You think about all the technology that we have today and how we work today versus how we worked 5 years ago. The jobs that the young people want tomorrow are very different, but one thing that we know, they're going to have to be able to think critically and to think across disciplines and across functions. That we know for sure.
And that's a great point. I think maybe the other thing I would say, John, is we each have a role to play in modeling what that looks like. So part of this problem of people thinking they can only be an I, part of it's an affordability question, and how do we do T in the same amount of time an I used to take, right? But some of it is also, if we as faculty or if we as employers model that success is the I, then we're our own problem, right? So to the degree that we model that we're learning every day, or that a team can get more done than any individual, not necessarily faster. It is always faster to just do it yourself, but it's not better. And so to the degree that we model that, I think it helps. And it comes to the same point of, rather than saying I can't do it because I needed 14 people to give me permission, well, what comes out of my mouth I don't need permission for most of the time.
Exactly right.
Right? So.
I would echo that, as well as my comment about T is part of tuition. Okay, because a lot of the things that make up the T are both how you think about liberal versus professional studies in your curriculum overall, which is part of the tuition if you want to really prepare people. The second part of this part of tuition is all the experiences that happen on your campus. This isn't about just another course, or another 5 courses, or another specialization, or another whatever. It's about all of these things that make up the experiences of our students. And how do we make those more purposeful for those who can't find their way? Because some will do it independent of us, and they'll do a much better job than if we planned it for them. But many will need a little bit of help and coaching about how to find their pathways. Along with what I said before, is that how do we make casual glances real encounters and meaningful encounters? And those are free. Those are free.
Well, please help me in thanking this panel.